Hi everyone, this is a follow-on video from my last video about building a Hex to RGB color converter app, and I mentioned that I wanted to record a video about testing this time, so that's what I'm here to do. And I want to talk about Mocha and Chai testing. So Mocha and Chai are two libraries that you can use to test your server-side code, and they run in the terminal, but they kind of act almost like they're coming from the browser, so they act like they're making HTTP calls or calls to your server or whatever from the browser, and then they can test your server-side code that way. Okay, so I npm installed Mocha and Chai. You can see them here in my package.json file. And then I'm wanting to test my server-side code. So I have files to test my converter JS file. So the converter.js file was one that I covered in my last video. It's just the file that contains all of the functions that I need for making my hex to RGB conversions for the values. And I also want to test my server file. So this is my server. It's just a normal Node and Express server. There's nothing too special about it. It has all of the routes in that I want to hit. So RGB to hex is the route that I want to hit when I'm converting RGB values to hex, and it calls the RGB to hex function from the converter file, which is just here. And then the same for the hex to RGB route when I'm converting hex values to RGB, calls the hex to RGB converter function from the file here. Okay, so I've built two separate files of tests for both the converter.js file and the server.js file. So I'll just quickly run through those. Okay, so this is the converter.js testing file. I mentioned that we're using Mocha and Chai. Mocha is the main library for testing that I'm going to be using. Chai is also included so that we can use certain keywords from the Chai library in conjunction with Mocha to give kind of more accurate tests and testing. And I'll cover that in a second. Okay, so we don't need to require Mocha, but we do need to require Chai at the top of the file. So I just have, we just want this one expect keyword from Chai for now. Chai has a ton of different keywords that you can use, like expect, for testing, and they're all really useful, but for now we just want to use expect. So we're saying require chai.expect, so that just pulls that one kind of keyword for the function out, and we're storing that in a variable also called expect. And then we're also requiring the converter.js file, the one that we want to test, so that we can call those functions and make sure that they're working properly. Okay, so with Mocha, you have these different keywords again, like with Chai, and you use those keywords to kind of build your tests with. So you have these describe statements. So describe functions let you, well, I've written notes on all my code to remind me. So it allows you to encapsulate expectations. I think that's a good way of describing it. So you kind of pass describe a string of descriptions about your feature or about functions or features inside your app that you want to test. So my first describe statement says color code converter because that's what my app is and that's what I'm testing. And then we pass this describe function. After we've passed it the string, we also pass it another function. So that calls the main body of the tests. And then the second nested describe statement lets you test different segments of this main color code converter feature. So first of all, I'm testing RGB to hex conversion, and then secondly, I want to test hex to RGB conversion. So inside the describe statements, we want to call it functions. So it is another keyword from Mocha, and that lets us describe what we expect the feature to do. So RGB to hex conversion is the feature, and obviously we want that to convert RGB values to hex. So we say converts the basic colors. And we pass that a callback function again. And what we're doing here is we're making three different variables called red hex, green hex, and blue hex. And in those variables, we are storing the result of calling this RGB to hex function from the converter file up here, RGB to hex. We're storing the result of calling that function with different RGB values. So for red hex, we're passing in 25500, which gives red, and for green, 02550, and then 00255 for blue. So in theory, these red hex, green hex, and blue hex values should give us the correct hex converted values from these RGB values back again. So this is where chai comes in, and we're using this chai expect keyword. And what expect does is just exactly what it sounds like. You know, we're saying we expect this variable that we have up here to be equal to the value that we're expecting. So we have red hex, which is the red RGB to hex values, to equal FF0000, which is the hex code for red. And then the same for green and the same for blue. And these two equal statements, this is just for comparing directly to different variables. So like this red hex code should be a string, and we're also passing this to equal statement a string as well, so it can directly compare these two features. So for hex to RGB conversion, it's a little bit different just because we're dealing with receiving 3 values in return rather than just one string like we do with the hex values. So again, describe hex to RGB conversion. This is your second nested describe statement. It converts the basic colors, just like with the RGB to hex conversion. We're just describing what the feature does and what we expect it to do. So now we have red, green, and blue variables, and in these variables we are storing the result of calling this hex to RGB converter function with different hex codes. So in theory, these red, green, and blue values should be equal to arrays of numbers that we get from converting these hex values back again. So in the case of red, FF0000 will give 25500, just the same as in the red hex variable up here. The only slight difference with the hex to RGB conversion is because we're getting arrays back rather than just a string like we are in red hex and green hex and the other variables up here. We have to use this to deep equal statement rather than just to equal. The reason for that is that to deep equal allows you to compare nested objects. So anything that's inside an array or inside an object or a dictionary, it allows you to compare those values rather than just something like a string, which is what to equal compares. So we're expecting red, whatever the result of this hex to RGB red variable is, to deep equal 25500 inside an array. And the same for green and the same for blue. So if we run these tests, I need to have my server running in the terminal. So my server is running so that my localhost port is active. And then if I go to another terminal window, if I just type npm test, that lets us run our Mocha tests. So you can see here, you get this nice little output in terminal with green checks or red crosses if your test fails. So these top two tests are what we're looking at right now. So we have RGB to hex conversion, it converts the basic colors, hex to RGB conversion converts the basic colors. Both of those tests have passed. Okay, so these 4 tests here are on the server side code. So on the server code, I'll show you those now. So if we go to our server.js test folder or file, sorry, again we need to require chai.expect for the keyword, and also we're requiring this request library. What request lets us do is make HTTP requests, so we can send an HTTP request across to hit our API URL that we constructed for the color converter app, and then we can see whether the server is returning the right response to us. So in the case of the server, we want to check not only that it's returning the right color values back again from calling the API, but we also want to check the status code to make sure that the API is being called properly. The API endpoint is giving us the right response back again. So we're describing color code converter API because we're calling the URL this time. Describe RGB to hex conversion just the same as before and pass it a function. And then we have this URL here that we're calling. So this is localhost 3000, which is the port that I'm running the app on locally. And then the RGB to hex is just the route within the server file. This is the route that calls this converter RGB to hex function, which is in this file. So if we hit the RGB to hex route with our query, then that'll call the RGB to hex conversion, and then vice versa for hex to RGB. So we've just built a URL query here. So we have localhost, RGB to hex, then a query, and then we're passing in red 255 and green 255 and blue 255 as our RGB values that we want to convert to hex. So first of all, we're checking to see whether it returns a 200 status code. So that means that we try and hit that URL, and if it allows the request to go through and responds normally without any errors, then that would be a 200 status code response. So request, again, is what we're using to call the HTTP request. So we pass it the URL, and then we also pass it this callback function. And this function receives the HTTP response back from request. So it receives the response body, and any error codes or messages that might be sent in place of the HTTP response if something's gone wrong. So we're saying we expect response.statuscode to equal 200, which means that the API URL has been called properly. We also have to pass this done callback function just at the end of the HTTP request, just because request is an asynchronous bit of code. So it means that when you fire off the HTTP request, if you pass it this done function, it means that it'll wait for the HTTP response to come back again before it runs this expect statement. Rather than if you miss this code out, the request will fire off and it'll immediately run this expect statement, even though the HTTP response hasn't returned yet. And I think, if I remember correctly, the test will pass, but it technically doesn't have an error code or a status code or anything to compare against. So for some reason it passes, but I'm not sure why that's the case. So anyway, you have to pass this done callback function just to tell it that it's asynchronous code. So then again, we're checking the response from the URL. So we make another request with the URL, we pass it a callback, which takes the error, the response, and the body. And we're saying we expect the response body to be equal to FFFFFF, which is the result of calling 255, 255, 255 with your RGB values. And the same for the hex to RGB conversion. We've built a URL here, which calls the hex to RGB route with this 00FF00 hex code. We want it to return status code 200. We make that request again with the request library, and then we want to return the color in RGB as well. So we're expecting the body of the HTTP response to be equal to an array that contains 02550. So you can see here, I'll run the tests again just as proof, but you can already see that they're passing in the terminal. So both of the URLs have returned the status code 200, and both of them have returned the color in hex or in RGB. So that's just a quick skim over the subject of Mocha and Chai testing. I hope it's not too, or I haven't described it in too confusing a way. It is quite simple once you get your head around it. You really just need to know those keywords that you can call. In terms of things like the asynchronous code with the HTTP response, it's a little bit more difficult because you have to pass it that done callback function just to tell it to wait rather than just to run the tests immediately. But testing is really quite simple once you get used to it, and it's something that you should really do with all of the code that you build, all of the apps that you build, because then you make sure that you have built your code to work exactly how you want it to, and that you're not getting any errors. You can write tests for all sorts of different use cases to test any kind of user input that you want to make sure that everything is passing and nothing's breaking your code. And so, yeah, tests are awesome and you should try and use them if you can. Okay, thank you for watching. Bye.